If you can work from a more soulful, less egoic, like what's really down deep inside you, fuel source, then that just changes things. And the company will see that. And it really has a major impact on your ability to make better decisions and to figure out the right strategy. Right? So it's not just enjoying the process more, and it's not just be a better person or a better human. It is literally tied to the success of the business. And that can be hard for a lot of CEOs to see. And so I try to break down the egoic scaffolding that surrounds people that they don't even see. It's insidious a lot of times. So if you're raising money when it's irresponsible not to, because your team is stretched really thin, you can't keep up with demand and things are really taking off, that's a good time to raise money. If you're raising money because you have some belief that things are really going to take off, if you can just get your brilliant product out to market, not a great time to raise money.
Welcome to Seed to Sequoia. I'm your host, Alex Shartsis. I'm super excited to have Dave Hersh on today. Dave, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Alex. Great to be here. So I am a former entrepreneur. I founded a company called Jive Software back in 2001. We bootstrapped it for 5 years, built out a healthy business that was profitable, and then decided to change things around and raised a bunch of money from Sequoia and some other investors and turned it into a public company over the next 3 years. And after that, I was leading it right up until its IPO, and then I moved on and worked as an investor advisor, sat on boards, incubated companies, did all manner of things, worked at Andreessen Horowitz for a couple of years as a board partner, worked in private equity for a while. Kind of saw the whole startup ecosystem from every angle, and both the positives and negatives of that ecosystem, and saw a lot of opportunities in these businesses that were in the middle ground where they didn't quite have the unicorn 100% growth metrics that the venture investors wanted, but had a good core business. So initially started acquiring those and consulting companies like that on their transformation, and saw so many patterns with companies that were trying to scale too quickly that could have been avoided, and where they could have been in a much higher likelihood position of building a successful company, that I wrote a book which came out earlier this year called Reignition. So I'm still in the mode of acquiring startups and transforming them into healthy businesses, but also couple that with doing a lot of speaking and writing and helping founders get out of their own way and understand what are those common patterns and those missteps that companies typically make on the way to building something great. And so that's kind of what I talk about today, is both, how to transform stuck startups into healthy, sustainable market leaders, but also how to build moats in businesses that are human first moats that have sustainability in a period of rapid AI expansion and cheap infrastructure.
Yeah, I want to get to the human first moats subject because that one just sounds super interesting. I think that you told the Jive story in like 40 words or less, but it's a much bigger story than that, because it sounded like a straight line, like raise money from Sequoia, went public. And I read your book. It was not a straight line. So maybe that's a good place to start. Like, what was this great sounding story in retrospect, raise money from Sequoia, went IPO, and then moved on with my career? Like maybe a little more of a blow by blow of like, what was that journey like, and what did you learn from that?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, we started out bootstrapped, which was primarily a reflection of that period. My first day to go meet the founders was September 11th in New York City. So needless to say, it was hard to even have an office together, much less go out and raise money in a traditional mechanism for startups. So we just started selling software. They had an open source application that was pretty popular, and we were able to take the brand that we had from the open source days and start converting people over to a paid version of the product, and just started building up the business from scratch.
How did they get to the point where they had, was it just a really quick build for the product, or did they raise some friends and family? Like, how did they get sort of to that point where they were able to go out and get customers in the very beginning?
Yeah, again, a lot of people knew it from its open source days. And what happened was there was a big company, Sun Microsystems, if you remember them, that wanted to use the application on a larger scale, and they agreed to pay consulting dollars to turn it into more of an enterprise application. And so when we did that, we relaunched the product as a paid product, and it was initially pretty inexpensive, and just started selling to developers, and it kind of took off from there. So we had never had to raise a dime, in the first 5 years, and got it to about 12 million in revenue. And it was very similar to Atlassian. They were actually friends of ours back then. They were a couple guys. We were a couple guys. And, we started going off on the same path that they were on. It looked very similar. They kept going on that path into great success while we went a different path that didn't turn out so well.
Well, yeah, we'll get there. But I think people forget that a lot of the .com companies, Microsoft as well, like they were wildly profitable at the beginning. Like there was no, we need to raise a $50 million Series A to get to like a place where we could maybe see profitability in the future, like $12 million in revenue profitable from a very early stage, which is a different way to run a business. I think it teaches different lessons.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't believe there is a lemming-like fundraising process that people are expected to go through that belies the truth of how real value is created. And part of the Jive journey that we can talk about is that those periods of austerity, when we were lean and disciplined and purposeful and focused, those were where all the value was created, right? The periods where we raised money from Sequoia and ultimately when it went public, those were the periods where we spent a lot of money in stupid ways. And, when we made a lot of mistakes and we tried to grow too fast and we tried to get out past our ski tips. So, and I saw this happen in multiple phases with the company. And, it was one of those things that karmically I reflected on as I wrote this book. And this book was really a letter to my former self, the book that I wish I had had as an entrepreneur, to see what the system really is and how to take advantage of it in the right way, how to exploit fundraising to good ends as opposed to assuming that that's the path you need to take.
Yeah. I think one doesn't have to have raised a ton of money from Sequoia or go public to make the same mistake, right? You could raise a $3 million Series A or Series Seed and also be wasteful and not create a lot of value. Like it's a lesson that applies to almost every early stage technology company.
Exactly. And the real difference is, are you pushing product to the market? Are you going too early and pushing product to the market? Or are you patient enough to wait for the pull of the market, right? So if you're raising money when it's irresponsible not to, because your team is stretched really thin, you can't keep up with demand and things are really taking off, that's a good time to raise money. If you're raising money because you have some belief that things are really going to take off, you can just get your brilliant product out to market, not a great time to raise money. And again, I think it tends to be lazy shorthand for a lot of entrepreneurs that we need to raise the seed and then go to the A in 18 months and then the B. And then they start trying to hit metrics which are intended to allow them to raise more money, right? Instead of building the business strategically towards the direction it really needs to go and where the market is allowing them to go. Not all businesses are built to be unicorns, but businesses could be really healthy supports to the people who work there and a system where they can grow and actually provide a lot of wealth to everybody involved if done in the right way and not looked at as we just have to get on the venture train. Instead, think about, what's the funding that's really going to support the most realistic long-term trajectory of this business that I have deep conviction in being able to execute on?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Well, let's go back to Jive because you're about to get to the point where things kind of go sideways. So you raise the money from Sequoia because things are going well. You're doing 12 million in ARR. And then what happens?
Yeah. So we were doing 12 million in ARR, but that was on, old perpetual license revenue, right? It wasn't subscription revenue. It was like they pay you, $10,000 and then they pay you $2,000 a year after that, right? And so it was $12 million and it was very profitable, but at that period of time, you were selling more of these perpetual licenses. And it was based on our original products. And what happened was when we raised the money from Sequoia, we had built out a new product which was meant to take us into the enterprise and represented something much larger. The hope was that we could convert a lot of those people from the early 12 million of revenue, those early customers, into the new product. The reality was that wasn't the case. So we raised the money to build a new go-to-market around this new product and try to convert some of our older customers over, but we weren't able to do so. However, we still ultimately did it. But when you raise money, what you hear from the investors is, okay, now you got to grow fast. Now put the put gas in the tank and really go aggressively. And we still had this team of managers who were used to the old way of doing things, which was developer-led sales, and you're just taking calls and taking orders over the phone. And suddenly you're being asked to pull in enterprise people who can go sell to GE, and meet with their CIO. And so there was a lot of missteps that were made along that way. You had, you didn't have the network of salespeople to go bring on. And so you were hiring people off the internet, right? And so you make the classic mistake
that was cool, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you're hiring people from, Oracle and IBM and these large companies that may have done well in a context where they have a huge team of people and existing budget dollars, and they just go in and shake hands and get paperwork done, to a world where you're pitching a new idea that's nascent. There's not even budget dollars for it. They don't know who you are. And they flailed, right? So we brought on a lot of people really quickly who were not the right people and who were managed by a team of executives who were used to the inside sales and low friction developer-led process. And suddenly you're asking them to do something very different. And so that system, as we got into 2008, we just started missing quarters because we didn't have the right team of people and we didn't have the right executives leading them. And then you had the economic collapse happen, right? So we missed 2 quarters, and then Lehman Brothers, failed. So
ruined it for everybody.
Yeah, and that was when Sequoia did their big presentation, or RIP Good Times, and so we were front and center for that presentation. And my CFO, who was with me, was actually quoted in that presentation, and so it was very much of that era. And it was the right thing to do to go through a layoff and restructure the team. And so I was really glad for that. I think the message was maybe a little heavy-handed at the time.
You mean that? That deck was definitely like, wow, you're really, they weren't wrong, but they definitely had not a great bedside manner about telling people.
No, they were definitely basically saying, please RSVP to this event in the affirmative as soon as possible. Yeah. So anyway, it was fine. The outcome was the right one, and that was to go through a layoff where we restructured the company, cut a third of the business, which was 60 people, got it into a place where it was putting more cash in the business than we were spending. And then as we got into 2009, we had a new executive team. We had a leaner overall organization. We started bringing on the right salespeople who were the ones befitting of that era of a company and going from early stage into a mature company. And things took off. And, in a time when a lot of people were clamping down, we crushed it in 2009. And we were putting more cash in the business than we were spending, because it was a period of economic uncertainty. So that was another one of those phases when we created a huge amount of value in the company and we were profitable while we were doing it. And so looking back, it was just, you had these periods where when people were galvanized by a shared mission, you had the right people in the right roles, you had the right executive, you had trust in the organization, and people loved that scoreboard of, hey, we're putting more cash in the business than we're spending. It feels good to people. They feel like I'm part of something. And then, the company's in a period where we can start taking it public. I had little kids at the time and never saw the family, and I was, getting crushed personally at that time, and I had to make that decision of being do I stay on and be the public company CEO? But I was going through a personal crisis at the time, suffering a lot of challenges mentally and emotionally. And, the board really handled it poorly. It was ultimately it was really the right thing ultimately for me to have a, period where I move out of the company to focus on other parts of life. But this was a really poorly equipped board to handle things like the mental health and wellness of the CEO. Right. And it's unfortunate because that's where ultimately a lot of the value is created. And this is not just a softer side of CEO. It's literally, this is the person who knows the company the best, who is the spiritual leader for the business, who has all that data, who has the intuition about the right thing to do. And if you replace them with a hired gun CEO who's financially driven, it's going to change the trajectory of the company in unfortunate ways. And you can see that value creation difference in the public markets. Companies that are founder-led still do way better than ones where you have a hired gun CEO. So learned a lot through that process. And, that's also baked into a lot of the elements of the book and how companies should go through these transitions and, how you can support CEOs throughout the entire process and make sure that they're in the best, athletic conditioning for the role that they're in.
Yeah, I want to come back to the mental health aspect and just like the excitement, because I found, we'll come back to it because I think it's a super important topic. On the sort of bumpy path of Jive, so when things didn't go well, curious if 2008 hadn't happened, if Sequoia hadn't sat everybody down and said, good times are over, do something about it, would you have made a change, or do you think you would have carried on? Was a couple quarters you missed enough to wake everybody up, or would you have carried on with the same team without making those tough choices?
I probably would have kicked the can down the road. So it may have been another quarter or so before we did a layoff, and maybe we would not have cut as deeply as we did. But I'm glad we did, for sure. And I think ultimately we would have had to do something.
And was it the product? I think what's interesting is a lot of founders, especially when they're sort of Series A stage, they're struggling with a new product that isn't selling, and they have a new sales team, and they're like, well, the sales team's complaining it's a product. Founders trying to figure out, is it the sales team, is it the product, is it the market, is it something else? It sounded like it was a new product, but you were pretty clear on the sales team being the wrong team and the executives managing being the wrong executives. But was that clear in the moment? Like, was that clear later, or was that like you could just tell at the time?
It's always really hard in the moment to know what's going on. And that's why it's so important for a CEO to really immerse him or herself in the work of the field. So I started developing an intuition around it when I just started doing, meetings with the field, with the teams of people that were out there. And it was very clear these were people who had no idea what we were selling, and they're used to their sales engineers doing all the work. And it was a new market. So basically we were selling, when Facebook came online and became a thing, people started asking, well, how do we have this technology inside our company? Right? We're still using Lotus Notes and SharePoint, but those are really ancient technologies. They don't fit in this world anymore. So how can we use Facebook-like technologies to collaborate among our employees and with our customers? So there was a massive tailwind behind us in terms of this category developing, and a lot of other companies trying to get into it. Our early start in being a collaboration software company gave us a good start, and that was why I raised the money. I didn't want to be left behind on this big space that was rapidly developing. So I had good intuition that it was going to become a big category, and we would need to define what that category was. We'd have to create that category in a lot of ways and work closely with analysts to do that. So I had good intuition that there was going to be a big market, but it took being out in the field and working hand in hand with some of these sales reps and seeing what was really going on to go, these are not the right people to do it. They are very ill-equipped as someone who is going to be able to partner with a large organization on a large rollout of technology like this, who can evangelize, who can work closely with getting people up to speed on what this new technology represents. And so I needed to be out there selling firsthand, and then realized, this is off on the wrong foot. And I think I see a lot of CEOs who hire a fancy sales executive and think, okay, they can take care of sales. Now the machine is in place. I can go back to what I do well, which is product. Like, that is the worst scenario possible, and usually ends in a lot of money spent and wasted and failure. And
that was my next question, was like, what about, do you still show up for the sales meetings or the weekly sales meetings if you're the CEO, if you've hired your, magic bullet VP of sales? I'm like, yes, like, you got to stay in touch, or bad things happen and you don't find out about them until the end of the quarter.
Exactly. And a great sales team, by the way, will pull you into that sales meeting. They want you because you are one of their best points of leverage to get big deals done. So you're going to get pulled in if you have a good team, and you should be doing it anyway. You really have to be out there. And all of that data collection, all of that stuff that you're doing out there is what forms the basis of a deep intuition that you need as a leader to be able to move quickly and nimbly.
Yeah, I think part of that is also, I think you're implying, like, staying close to the customers. Like, what are they actually saying, not what's getting filtered through the sales team. If you're not even hearing the filtered part, that's even worse. But like, if you can get in front of customers, you just stay in better touch with what the market, what they want, right? What are they asking about? What are their objections?
Yeah, exactly. And I was the lead sales exec on a lot of deals. I was, doing some of the biggest deals personally, right? I think that's kind of important, right? And you know what it's like out there, and you know how to do these deals that are reflective of the market that you're in and the product that you're that you're pitching and all of its relative differentiation and competitive advantage.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I really wanted to talk about you, which comes up really at the beginning of the book, is this concept of waste, because I think I want you to define it. But for me, I saw it from a different perspective, which is that founders end up giving up a big chunk of their company, giving up control of their destiny, and it doesn't work out, right? So on just a basic level, it's like, it feels like a mistake. But you articulated it in a much more interesting way. Can you just share what that, how you talk about waste?
Yeah. There is a little discussed part of venture capital, which is that they make their money on 10% of companies doing really well. In almost 80% of investments, the money, they fail to even get the investor money back. But founders believe they have an 82% chance of success, by and large, right?
Yeah.
So within that chasm, I mean, I'm all about, unbridled optimism, but, when the glass is not even half full, it's, 10% full. Like, you really have to be realistic about it. And I do think that because they have that unbridled optimism, they start seeing funding as the means to go achieve their objectives rather than funding as the means to fuel the goodness that's already happening in the market. That, to me, was the waste problem, right? Which is, sure, 10% of the companies do well, and that's how everybody makes their money. That's how these investors are making their money. But then there's maybe 30 or 40% that just failed to launch, that maybe never should have made it in the first. There were science experiments that didn't work. But in between, you have this 50 to 60% of the invested companies, these venture-backed companies, that have good promise, but scale prematurely, right? They push product to market too early. They build sales organizations too early. They raise money too quickly. And as a result, I kind of see it like they're middle distance runners. Like, they're supposed to be running a 1500, but they're sprinting out of the gate like it's a 100-meter dash.
Right.
And they don't even finish the race because they're just, they exhausted themselves too early. But if they could be leaner longer, if they could actually be patient and evaluate growth opportunities thoughtfully while the business is lean and disciplined, and manage the metrics around learning, right? Around the curiosity of how do we get to market pull, as opposed to like, we got to launch, we got to push something out to market, that the likelihood of success for those companies would be much higher, right? So I would take these companies that did that and then recap them and now say, let's do this thoughtfully. Let's get profitable and let's experiment with growth, and let's just, grow at 30% a year. And that's fine. And by the way, keep growing at 30% a year, over 5-6 years. That's really good outcome for everybody. But it also gives you the time and space to thoughtfully experiment with growth opportunities. It could represent more outsized growth. And if you do tap into those, then you can finance the business with more money, because you can get to 60 or 70% growth, or you've got, maybe an acquisition you could do, to really corner the market and solidify your place in the overall category. So I saw that as the waste problem. Investors, and what happened when the growth of venture capital was wild, right? It was $8 billion a year when I got out of college 30 years ago, and it's now over $300 billion a year. So you saw this massive industry that has grown. And by the way, an industry that has grown on a 10% success rate, right? You don't see that too often.
It's better than Major League Baseball.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we are good 10% of the time, right? And it turned into a massive industry. And so you had all this money that was chasing deals, and it's a lot of smart people, and the entrepreneurs feel like, well, it makes them feel good, right? Like, I feel wanted. I feel like I'm doing something, and it looks good to me if I raise money to my peers, to whoever I'm trying to impress. And I've been there. I get it. I understand. And it frees up a lot of resources, and you can start hiring people to, grow the company more quickly. But you do have to accept the risk inherent in taking that money, and to know that I'm getting on a train which has a 10% chance of success, and the investors are okay with that 10% chance. But for all the blood, sweat, and tears for the founding team, for the execs, for the people who work in these businesses, that's a high risk. And I think a lot of times they don't necessarily do the calculus on that risk as it relates to the time value of, that they're spending, the time that they're spending on the business, as well as all the team. And, it results in a lot of demoralized people and, depression after these businesses are over and stress. And, it doesn't have to be that way. So that's the waste problem that I see, is just a big system of investment that has created a lemming-like process that entrepreneurs believe they should go through that is not in alignment with their belief about the odds of success. And if they knew that going leaner longer would really increase their chance of being successful, then I think they would look at a different path. So I'm not against venture capital by any means. I'm just against too much too soon and what the industry has become in terms of this behemoth, industry monster that is maybe shaping the ideas of what it means to build a company, and in an unfortunate way.
Yeah, I mean, the people that lose from the waste are the founders, right? The VCs are fine because they get their 2% management fees and they get their 10% winners. They'll be fine. It's and the 30 to 40% that fail because it was a science experiment. I would argue the founders are better off because they got to do the experiment quickly, find out it didn't work, move on with their lives, go do something else. It's the other ones that could have had a good business, like you said, grow 30% a year if they took it slowly and really figured things out, but they pour on the gas too early and sprint out the gates and blow up. Because as soon as you close your Series A, like if you need to hit your metrics within 24 months to close your Series B, like there's no getting off the ride and going and doing something else. I mean, eventually like options like your private equity buyouts and things like there are now, but like that financially is not nearly as good as actually hitting your metrics and going and raising the B. Like as soon as you're on the train, you're on, like you got to hold on tight. You kind of signed up for that, even if it wasn't the right choice.
It's exactly right. In giving my talk on the book, the percentage of entrepreneurs who have been through this who say, "I wish I had known," is staggering.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was in that boat. I mean, we were, same exact thing. Like there was one moment where we signed a bunch of customers like really quickly. It was like, oh, maybe we have product market fit, and our advisors and investors were like, you got to hire salespeople. And I was like, I don't know though. Like we haven't really delivered yet. Like we got to figure that out. They're like, if you want to raise an A, because we were seed funded at the time, if you want to raise an A, like look at the math, do the math. You've got 6 months of cash or 8 months. Like you need to scale up now. And we didn't. It was a disaster. Like it was, it didn't work, right? We hadn't figured everything out. If we just spent the 3 months that I thought we needed to get the product right, we could have scaled up great, but instead we kind of rushed it, as exactly the scenario you described, right? You hired too many salespeople. Maybe the product there isn't pull yet, or there might be the beginnings of pull, but you haven't figured everything out. And all of a sudden you're sprinting. So.
Yeah. And how demoralizing as a CEO, right? The business is actually working. I had a coaching call with somebody yesterday, right? The business is working. They're growing at 30% a year. The board is breathing down their neck simultaneously for growth, which they're scrambling to do. But, it's only 30% and they're working their tails off. And then they get to the board meeting and they're just like, 30%? Like, I don't even know why I'm invested in this. You guys aren't really cutting it, right? And that's demoralizing. It feels terrible, right?
Even though it's a good business. Like, it's like this. I think that a lot of, this is part of what you talk about, not directly in the book, but like a lot of, or especially first-time founders, really go off what the investors want versus what the customers want. And if you're focused on the customer side of it, you'll end up building a nice business, right? If there's a nice business to be built, I think we should talk about like when to quit, when to realize like maybe this isn't working, because that's an important subject for a lot of founders. I think that the investors though, like they have their own motivations and they're very different than customer motivations. And if you're doing stuff as CEO just to make your investors happy, it can lead to a lot of waste and a lot of thrash and a lot of sort of just stress. Yeah.
And investors are often confused about, am I pushing them hard for go-to-market metrics, right? Are you growing fast? And what are your gross margins? And what's your CAC and LTV and all these things? Or am I pushing them really hard on strategy, which in my mind, often is lower growth while you really figure out the model that works. And then you can sprint later, right? Just walk for a long time. And I think those things get confused. And greener CEOs will try to respond and do things to make the board happy that are costing the business strategic clarity that could be better served for that long-term sprinting. So it gets really confusing, especially for, these younger or greener CEOs who are in the room with these really, smart people, but smart people who are applying pattern recognition, not a deep understanding of that business and the nuances of that market.
Yeah. So one of the things you talk about in the book that I thought was really interesting was like being really honest with yourself about whether you have a business worth saving. Like, let's say you're in that sort of 30 to 40% that venture isn't working. It's growing 30%, but it's not growing enough. Or, the venture people are upset. How do you work with founders to help them understand, like, is this a business worth saving?
In the book, I talk about the 4 C's, which are, do you have conviction? Right? Do you really believe there's something here? And are you excited about the future? You just feel like structurally things are in the way of getting to that feature that you can see and believe in. Is there a core to the business? Is there something that you do better than any other company in the world? Right? Do you have some special sauce that is unique to your company, some magic, your X factor? Even if it's for a small market, even if it's just knowledge or awareness of a certain technology, right? Is there something that you have, ideally, that the market rewards you for, that loves you for? And, do you have a chess move? That's the 3rd C, which is there a strategy you want to run, right? What's the thing that you want to do in the market? Is it going after a new market? Is it investing into a new technology to augment what you're doing already, right? But that ideally data-backed hypothesis that you've tested around this is what we want to do as a business, this is what we're going to do. And finally, it's the C is cash, right? Can you do this for a reasonable amount of cash that you have the ability to pull on? Or can you do it with the existing cash flow? Can you do it profitably? So those 4 C's are where I dig in with people when they're in that situation, right? If their company is stuck, which means they're no longer in alignment with their goals or the investor goals, people are frustrated, the business feels like it's in an eddy and not flowing down the river that it's meant to flow down, right? And oftentimes what you find is it's stuck for structural reasons because they do have venture investors on board and they're not going to be happy with 20, 30, 40% growth and they want something much bigger. And the founder now sees, well, we can actually build a healthy business here. We just, maybe can't please the investors. And that's just an unfortunate situation. And that's one I see all the time, which is the founder CEO going, they're just mad at us all the time, but there's a real business here. I'm just so sick of them. They're not giving us advice that we need anymore and we can't make them happy. And it just feels like we're losing, even though we have a really interesting business and we could go this direction. It's frustrating. And so, yeah, you have people who are investing in businesses that have a 10% hit rate that want to see you build, a unicorn, right? And that's what their model is. And if you don't, it's hard for them, right? Because they've invested in a valuation and with a portfolio thinking that requires them to get 10x types of returns. And if you're not on that track, they don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And then these businesses that try to do that don't succeed, but along the way realize there actually is something we're doing really well. And if we could just optimize around that thing for now and give ourselves a little bit more time and space to grow this business, there's something there. And that's the heartbreaking disconnect, right? Because by that time, a lot of times it's too late for some of these companies. But in the buyouts that I do are often in that situation where we just recap it and say, let's just get 30% growth. Let's do it profitably. Let's take our time and let's thoughtfully experiment with growth that extends from our core, not is thrashing for growth wherever we can find it and stressing people out and confusing the company with too many disparate strategies.
Yeah, I think that the growth thing, I talk to founders all the time who, have maybe 2 to 5 million in ARR and they're, like it's working, right? They have a core of the business, but they're like chasing TAM to make their investors happy and like launching other products. And it's like, you could grow this, but it takes them further and further away from the core of what makes the company unique and interesting. And it's purely in pursuit of, well, the investors, we need to raise our Series B or we need to raise our Series C. And so I got to find more market to go after. And it's tough because they have like you said, right? They have a good business. It's just not the business that their board was looking for when they invested. But it leads to all this conflict and waste because, like, what are you going to do? Like, the business is only the market is only as big as it is, especially in I find that happens more often in new markets where nobody really knows how big it is going in, right? It's all forecasts and hope. And then as the market materializes, you might realize, oh, this is huge, or oh, it's not actually as big as we thought.
Yeah. And then they'll often do the math internally of like, if we didn't raise the venture, no, we just went after this market, we'd build something that would make us all wealthy, because it could get acquired for a lot less money and we'd all do really well on it, including the employees. We'd have a lot more fun along the way and we'd feel like we were ahead of the scoreboard and not just constantly trying to, as you say, chase TAM to make investors happy, which just confuses everybody and often leads to failure because it's too unfocused and it's hard to make all those different buyer profiles happy. And at the time when you're in the fog of war, it's hard to see that happening, but that's what happens a lot of times. And I see them on the other end of that gauntlet when they're like, I wish I had known, and I could have done better by everybody involved in this company and just enjoy the ride a lot more if we hadn't tried to go the venture 100% growth, A round, B round, lemming-like process, which, by the way, dilutes them along the way anyway, alongside giving them a huge wall they have to climb, in sales just to reach the valuation.
People don't talk about the dilution. I mean, even the most thoughtful founders, if you have two founders, like, you're going to own less than 25% of the company by your Series B, even if you're really, really good at raising, unless you're like one of the 2 or 3% that has some insane, OpenAI style valuation. Like, most of those people are going to end up much more diluted than they realize going in. That's not part of the marketing that VCs put out.
There's also an elephant in the room here, which is that, that period where you could invest in the infrastructure that gave you a moat and first mover advantages is coming to a close. The infrastructure for technology is so cheap now and so democratized. And as AI starts taking over more and more of that stack and it becomes easier to replicate technology, it's very hard to hold on to competitive advantage. And so this idea that venture investors were investing in companies that could build out the infrastructure of tech, IP, and network effects that would be the moat that would drive long-term value, starting to come to a close. I mean, just like traditional SaaS companies, can they even function in this world? Like, if, companies could just build their own software so quickly, cheaply, internally, and the computers are actually writing the code at some point, and more of it, how do you hold on to that, right? And so the venture model starts to break down a little bit, unless you have deep tech IP, or you're in pharma, or, there's, manufacturing good, and there's real assets. Like, what are you holding on to, right? Because the technology is just getting so cheap to replicate. And so that trend is one that I think is going to cause a lot of these funds to not make their money, because the typical model that venture is based on starts to go away, right? And that's where I've focused my next book, is really on what does competitive advantage look like in an age when technology is totally commoditized, and, when computers start taking over the means of production jobs that humans have been doing for a while, and it just starts to get a lot more efficient, right?
Yeah. I mean, anybody with Copilot, anybody can write code. Like, you don't have to, now it's getting to the point where you literally don't have to know how to code to be able to actually ship functioning, compiling, working code that's not terrible. It's maybe not the best code ever, but it gets the job done. And I think that there are a lot. One of the things you talked about in there was really a trigger for me, which is like investors caring about IP, where like your customers may or may not. And I think there are a lot of people that we did this, like the investors, like, oh, you have to go talk to IP attorneys and patent stuff. And I'm on patents that are totally ridiculous. It's like, this is not even core to the business. It's just the thing that the IP lawyers were able to get a patent on, given that we were working in a space where there was challenging patent law, because the investors thought patents would be helpful, which it's like they're not. It doesn't, customers don't care. Right? I think that some of these old models where it's like, in the 90s, having patents was maybe valuable, right? But today, like it is, so somebody in India builds the same thing. What are you going to do? Sue them? Like, your customers are going to go over there if it's 90% cheaper and does a better job. So I think that the balance, as you talk about, of like what makes a defensive competitive advantage today, like, or 5 years from now, right? Because if you're starting a company today, the advantage like that, you need a lasting competitive advantage. You don't need one that just works for 2025. It becomes harder, right, to figure that out as a founder.
Very much so. I think the companies are just going to look a lot different, right? And so I went into this saying, well, what's the last frontier of competitive advantage? With everything else starts to become commoditized. And by the way, I'm already seeing this. This is not Pollyanna, like I think AI is going to take over everything. This is saying, no, I'm already seeing this with companies that were built in the last 10 years on a particular infrastructure and a particular pricing and packaging model, that you're starting to see entrants just eat from below, right? Or it's just they're coming in and have a much cheaper product that is really hard to compete with and to sustain. So if you're a $50 million company and it's based on $200,000 contracts annually, and you have another company who's coming in saying, we'll do it for $10,000.
Right.
Right.
Well, this happened to Optimizely. Yeah, this exact thing happened to Optimizely. They were a darling of the valley, and then VWO stood up in India and charged 90% less and had a product that did basically the same thing and cannibalized their whole market.
Yeah. It's so easy to do now, and it's just that is going to increase. So my book is about the last frontier of competitive advantage, which is the human side. And I think this is the thing that, we've always eschewed, the venture investors have, which is, well, we want really high gross margins. We want everything to be automated. We want, a company with, 20 million in revenue and 12 people working there. Right. And, sure. That's great. I don't think that lasts the long term. And I think what you're seeing is now the opposite, which is, can you invest in the human side of it? And, every angle of the business I find fascinating. Like, how is building product going to change? And how can we look more at the emotional market openings, the emotional landscape of what people really want, and use that as the basis to build better products? How do we really buffer services alongside the technology that we're serving to make sure that we are capable of achieving different ends and a different kind of collaborative tapestry of working with customers? How do we change the way that we recruit employees? How do we, reskill people for the things that humans are going to be in high demand for, like empathy and curiosity and connection and relationships and humor and, these creativity, the things that we are going to need humans to do, right? And how do you foster that inside of a business? How do you keep your employees working at their best because they feel like they're thriving and growing and they love what they do? And so I think every lens of a business can be looked at differently if you imagine the business as a system of human flourishing. And those are the businesses that will actually have a real moat to stand on in this era, because the technology is just going to be harder and harder to do that. And so I find it fascinating. And I've spent this last bit of time collecting stories of these companies that are doing really interesting things by investing in the human side. And how do you do that? So kind of putting my, work that I'm doing in that lens. What's the future of competitive advantage, specifically around human first competitive advantage and helping people be better at what they want to do and build companies from that lens, as opposed to trying to automate and optimize everything, because I think that ultimately is a race to the bottom. And we saw that happen in e-commerce, when the data became pure and all the e-commerce companies just kind of whittled down to racing for pennies. We're going to see the same thing happen in industries like SaaS and some of these consumer digital products. Anything that relies solely on digital, it's hard to hold on to that.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting perspective. I think you talked about something else human related earlier, which was this sort of leadership and the mentality, the mental health of the CEO. So, I mean, you and I, you talk about Jesse Puggi in the book, and Jesse and I were I was with Jesse in the CEO group with Dave Cashin in the book, for the story you talk about in the book. So it's very close to home because just to give people background, like Jesse was the founder of a very successful bootstrapped agency, Ambush, that was doing all the things that you want to do as a founder. He controlled his destiny. He was working with his friends. He was minting money. He was, and he was miserable. And so you talk about it in the book. I'd love to hear kind of your conversation with him and like what, in the context of, you talked about the board doing the wrong thing when you were at Jive. Like, how does the CEO's mental health or the founder's mental health play into this whole journey?
Yeah, I love that you know Jesse. He's great, and it's a really cool story of the business won't transform until the leaders do, right? Which is a big point in my book, right? And so I started the book talking about some of the things we talked about, which is the systemic challenges, right? How the system of startups gives rise to a lot of failure, more so than I think is reasonable. But there's also the inner side of that, which is how does that system play on our egoic blind spots? And so in the book, I tell this story of Jesse, who grew up under what he called a very hard charging father, who was, by the way, also an entrepreneur, right? And he was a kid who wanted really he really wanted to please his father, to be successful in that realm. And I know a lot of people like that, right? And he worked his way to Wharton undergrad. He did the McKinsey, he did the Goldman Sachs thing. Like, he was a powerhouse of like, I'm going to make this work. And then he did, the ultimate, edible move, which is I'm going to be an entrepreneur too, right? And I'm really going to prove myself on the entrepreneurial battlefield. And he certainly did that from a results standpoint, but the energy with which he was building this company was one of proving himself through the company, right? So he was overly identified with it, and it was success at all costs, and clearly in an effort to, earn the love and respect of his father, his family, and his peers. And that same energy, that drive to, I will make this happen no matter what. I know a lot of us have seen that in entrepreneurs. I think that can be successful in that 0 to 1, get the business off the ground. I wouldn't say successful if it works, at least in terms of the metrics. But it certainly begins to create a very difficult culture, right? And that's what happened for Jesse, right? He got this company off the ground. They were very successful in the early days, but the Glassdoor reviews were brutal, and it was a dog-eat-dog culture. There was a lot of turnover, and he was burning. He was burning himself, and he was burning the company to achieve the goal that he wanted to achieve. And he was burned out. And so he tried to sell the company because he was like, I just, at some point, he's just like, I can't do this anymore. And that makes sense because that is a fuel source that burns bright and hot, but it burns out quickly. And he wasn't able to sell the company, but he was able to sell a lot of the equity to an investor who came in. And along with that, had cashed in some of his chips and suddenly had a bunch of money. And getting that money was a way for him to feel like, well, I had succeeded in what I thought I wanted, but I'm still miserable, right? I'm still in this company, and I don't know what I want. I don't know why I'm here. And is this really what I want to do with my life? It's clearly not curing cancer. I'm working on, marketing, right, analytics and automation, right? Like, this isn't, what I meant to do. And, the company is, I just feel like everything I'm doing is a should, not a want, right? Like, he's there just to do it because he believes he's supposed to be doing it, but didn't want to. And so that was when the investor brought in Dave Cashin, who to be a coach. And I think they went through a pretty exhaustive process to look at, well, where is your real motivation and why are you here and what matters? And, over the course of their working together, Jesse started to realize that what he loved most, when you clear away all that egoic baggage from the early days, what he loved most was helping people and helping them grow. And so to reimagine the business as this system of growth, right, where it's not about the content necessarily. You don't have to be curing cancer as a business, but the context, which is how do you use this business for good? And so he shifted his focus and really doubled down on building a healthy culture and supporting his people in their own growth and making them better. And that became the essence of the company. alongside doing what is big in my book, which is cutting the company down back to its core, right? Distilling it down to what its essence was and what it does the best in the world, and getting rid of these non-core extraneous activities that were dragging the business down, that were less profitable and distracting. So you had these two things happening simultaneously, and the business became really successful and healthy, right? It had that great mix of accountability and execution alongside great culture and thriving, growing employees who cared about each other. And it obviously, this was a pure example of your company won't transform until you do. And it continued to do well, to the point where Jesse realized, I'm not the best leader for this company anymore. He brought in another CEO, and ultimately the business was sold in a great transaction. And Jesse went on to do a venture studio that capitalized on a lot of these same values and core beliefs that he had about, essentially why he's on this planet.
Yeah, I mean, Jesse said it was actually some of the best advice I ever got. That he was just ad-libbing when he said it, because he was like, I'm looking for a CEO, and how would, if I were my own boss, how would I think I'm doing as CEO? And he realized he was doing a totally shit job. Like he wasn't, he just kind of, it wasn't his focus. It wasn't really what he wanted to be doing. So, and he was just like, oh, wow, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to hire somebody for this job, I should actually do the job well, because I'm going to be their boss eventually. And it was this sort of like aha moment for me as a founder, especially if you're bootstrapped or you have a very friendly board or whatever. You can get sideways with a venture board, and that's different. And you do really have a boss there, whether or not you wanted one. But in the early stages, especially when it's kind of your own motivations, it's easy to think you're doing a good job and not really be honest with yourself. And when you really step back, which Jesse did, and he was like, I'm not spending my time terribly well. Maybe they hit the numbers, maybe they didn't, but he was just like, you can't hide from yourself. I could be doing a much better job if I really applied myself. And part of it was, I don't really like doing this job, so I want to hire somebody else. But in the meantime, I should maybe give it my all and not just kind of phone it in. It was a really interesting insight, because again, you sort of assume somebody that's successful has just got it all figured out and, is doing everything right. And by his own admission, he was like, I'm doing 30% of it right. I should probably step it up here, so I can hand, a playbook over to somebody who that's the right playbook. That isn't like the lazy, the CEO for Dummies playbook, or the lazy guy's guide to being CEO of this company. So I thought it was really, you talk about the importance of honesty and the importance of being honest, both as a characteristic of successful founders and entrepreneurs, but also in that transformation period of really being honest about yourself, what your motivations are, what your core, what the business is actually good at, whether it is really a viable business, the rest of it. And I thought the Jesse story was a great example of that. I'm curious if you've seen that in other pattern play out in other companies where the CEO goes from not really being fully honest about what they want and their skills and transforms.
Yeah, I see it a lot. It's one of the things I go into first when I get into coaching or consulting and advising relationships with some of these folks, and say, why are you doing this? Where's your motivation come from? And, to try to get to, usually there's some stock answers, but then you can keep digging, and you start to realize what's really going on. And this is very important for people who want to transform their company. They definitely have to transform themselves first. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It's like being in a series of unhealthy relationships, right? You're going to keep getting with the same people and doing the same things unless you really excavate the root structure and clean house. And so it's vitally important. And that these, being a CEO is so hard as it is. If you are burdened by a desire to please other people, or if this business is some identity for you where its success or failure is too tightly tied to your own, you're going to start making bad decisions, and you're going to lose a connection to your intuition. And that intuition is what is going to be the fuel source for the greatest value creation. Right? So it's not just enjoying the process more, and it's not just, hey, be a better person or a better human. It is literally tied to the success of the business. And that can be hard for a lot of CEOs to see. And so I try to break down that egoic scaffolding that surrounds people that they don't even see. It's insidious a lot of times. And in doing so, what it does is free them up to act more intuitively, to be the leader that the company needs, to be honest with themselves, and to also own the mistakes of the past. Because remember, I'm working a lot of times with companies that have gotten stuck. And so to get unstuck means owning the mistakes of the past and doing the hard work like Jesse did to reimagine yourself and to tap into a deeper, more inexhaustible fuel source that is more uniquely you, right? Ego is a short burning, fast burning, and it burns everybody out, in terms of it as a process. And if you can work from a more soulful, less egoic, like what's really down deep inside you fuel source, then that just changes things. And the company will see that. And it really has a major impact on your ability to make better decisions and to figure out the right strategy and to avoid doing things like raising too much money or trying to grow too quickly, right? Because those are decisions that are often burdened by a desire to be seen or to achieve, because of how it looks in the world. And if you get past all that stuff, you can really be the steward that the company needs at that phase of its growth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, this has been a great conversation. We have a couple minutes left, and so much of what you do has to do with scaling go-to-market at the right time. So are there any pieces of advice that you would give people or sort of a framework that you could share around, if I'm a founder, whether I've raised money or not, I think it does, whatever stage of company I'm at, how do you think about this is a good approach, or this is a repeatable approach to not jumping the gun, right? Like you talk about pull, how can you tell as a founder that you're at that point where you should scale? And then how do you tell who the right people to scale with are? Because the book is all about people really on some level. How do you think about that?
Yeah. I often reference an old HBR article called The Sales Learning Curve by Mark Leslie, who is the founder CEO of Veritas. And I go in to teach the Stanford MBA students in their sales management class twice a year on this subject. And they do a case study on my old company. But what it does is break the development of a company or a new product into three phases, right? Where you have that introductory phase, which is getting a new product out to market and learning. And at the other end, you have the maturity phase as things are really, taking off and it's working. And in between, you have this transition phase, where you're trying to figure out what real repeatability looks like. For each of those three phases, you have different characteristics of the people who do well in that phase. And I think it's vitally important, as we've talked about, for the CEO, for the leader, founder, to understand what it's really like out there. So they're speaking from deep experience, right? Where I see people get into problems is they hire somebody because they don't understand it, or think this person's going to come in and figure things out for me, right? And so you have to be just as credible, if not more, than that person you're bringing on in terms of figuring out that ideal go-to-market. So in the early phase, you get people who are collaborative business builders. They call them Renaissance salespeople who are capable of being in marketing meetings and product meetings. And, they love building companies, right? And that's their motivation. They want to create new things that don't exist, right? And so they're very creative, very collaborative, very humble business builder types. And at the other end, where you have what we used to call coin-operated salespeople, right? And that's in the mature phase, right? And that's when everything's known, and it's just it's a machine that can operate more predictably in the market. But in between is also this really tricky phase where you go from essentially product market fit to repeatability, right? And that path can be shortened if you have people who really understand what that phase looks like, and that's the trickier one. So after you do have product market fit and then you're starting to take off, call it 1 to 2 million in sales or something. How do you go from that to much deeper sense of repeatability? And it's people who have a combination of those kind of humble, Renaissance, flexible, collaborative skills of the early phase, mixed with more of that strategic process orientation of the later stages. And they know how to start experimenting while putting some of that machinery in place, right? And not trying to put too much machinery in too quickly. So I think if you can kind of look at the business in those three phases of its growth, then you can think about the go-to-market and the people you bring on as representing the ideal set of skills for each phase, and not think about it as I just need to hire one sales leader and sales equals one box, or marketing is just this one machine that we need to put in place. It doesn't work well, right? It's a slow process, and a process means that there are different people with different DNA who are going to be best suited to where you are in that process. And understanding the nuances of that can be incredibly important and can make or break a company because it's so expensive if you get it wrong.
Yeah, I think founders are very, especially that Renaissance person, if you find one, that describes me. Like I'm not coin operated. I don't need to make $1 million a year selling the same thing.
You don't need to get the big check on stage.
No, it's I don't need to win the trip to Cancun as the top salesperson. Like I probably could do all that, but I'd be miserable, right? It's much more fun for me to figure out how does this business work? Like what do the customers really want out of this new technology? Like that's the part that I really enjoy. I think that other people are much better at. I have friends who are top salespeople at places like Oracle or TIPCO or whatever, and they're like, yeah, they've been making great money doing really boring stuff, but they enjoy it, right? It's fun for them, and that person's a very different person. If you put him at a 0 to 1 startup, it would be a nightmare, and vice versa. And I think that a lot of founders are afraid to admit they made a mistake, whether that's putting the late stage person in too early or leaving the early stage person in too late. Like it's hard to say like, oh, I've been working with this guy for 3 years. It's just not the right guy. I don't know if there's an easy way to have those conversations. You just have to be honest with yourself.
Very much so. And it's really good that people like you are out there doing that work. And I recommend it all the time. It's like, it's hard to find good people to do what you do. And I think it can be the difference between, these companies succeeding or failing if they can really understand the nuances of early stage go-to-market and experimentation. So I talk about it a lot in the book and, what you need at different phases. But it, to me, is one of those things that as the guy who sees companies at the failure end of the gauntlet, the stuck end, it's what gets them into trouble so often. And if they just had a better playbook and understanding of those nuances, it would do a lot to support a healthy trajectory.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thanks for that. So is there any advice that like 3 or 4 things that you would tell every founder? Like it doesn't have to be related to go-to-market, but like what are the things that you would say like, hey, this is sort of a best practice. If you're going to do one thing, do this thing.
I think we've talked about a lot of them. Go leaner, longer, right? Focus on a small market first. Don't just think you have to go after a big market to justify money. That's actually anathema to, I think,
counterintuitive, but it's completely 100%. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The concept of a beachhead market and, just be really, and to spend more time in that beachhead than you think, and to really own it and do it well, is one of the things that I see happen quite a bit. To be a scientist for longer, I think people really want to get out and push product and grow and do the thing. And so if you can be in that science mode of learning longer than you feel comfortable with, and make sure that you are matching your objectives, your strategic objectives of the business to learning and not growing. What I see happen a lot of times is the theater of founders wanting to show off growth metrics before that's really adequate for where the business is, right? And it just gets confusing and it creates a false narrative for the business. The investors want now to see that. So I think if you can go leaner, longer, and really be in that learning process for as long as possible, that's one of the best things you can do. And for funding, think about the funding that reflects the true opportunity for this business. Don't just go assuming that you need to raise $10 million and you need to do that. It rarely works out, in your favor if that's your approach. But if you really understand what the market looks like and develop that intuition, then fund the business accordingly. Instead of raising 10 million, raise 2 million. Do it on a convertible note. Go leaner, longer, figure things out. And then when you have deep conviction and your team is getting stretched really thin and you're really feeling that pull, then you can think about doing more financing. But until that point, it's just going to be a lot of wasted energy. And that's where I see a lot of these companies fail. So I would say those would be the major ones.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you can always get on the ride later. It's very hard to get off the ride.
Yeah.
So staying lean longer is great. It's all great advice. What's the best advice that you ever got?
It's a good question. I think I get inspiration from a lot of places. And, for me, it was about understanding my core DNA, that kind of soul. It was to kind of distill everything back down to soul. And I know that's a word that may be, off-putting to some people, but I think you can call it whatever you want. It's your essence, and so there was a book called The Soul's Code by James Hillman. It was, kind of a great psychology guy who my dad actually knew, was how I got originally connected to him. And, that book was really meaningful to me in terms of understanding that deeper, more inexhaustible fuel source that I should be working from. And the more I'm working from soul and less from ego and what society is telling me, the more I produce in the world, the greater that production, the happier I am. And, the more fulfilled I am with everybody and the more connected I am to other people. And so to me, it was that. And I think businesses have a similar thing, right? You have an essence of the business, you have a soul, you have this core. And the closer you operate to the soul of your business, to that core, the more magic you create in the world. Right? And if that gets compromised by wanting to prove things to other people or hit certain metrics, that the market takes note, the employees take note, and you start building something that is unhealthy. So just like humans going through transformation and trying to, get back to why we're on this planet as an individual, I think businesses have a very similar one, which is, there's a reason this business should exist, and stay with that for as long as possible, work from that place, and you'll create something beautiful in the world and people will take note. And, those to me are the most enlightened and ideally successful businesses.
Yeah, no, that's phenomenal advice. Well, so before I ask where people can find you, what are you up to next? Like you've done a lot of stuff. The book's out, has been out for a little while now. Like you talked about the next book. What's next for you?
Yeah, so I'm working on a book which is about building competitive advantage through human means. So as AI takes over the tech stack, how do you begin to find competitive advantage through reimagining your business as a system of human flourishing and getting better people and servicing the market better and really just reimagining what a business can be. So I'm spending a lot of time on that. I have a newsletter, which is along that line. So ideas for people for really how to build a moat, that is going to be sustainable, and trying to put out more ideas around, how do you really build strategic advantage? How do you really build something valuable that has a chance to last and that is different than what you're going to hear in a lot of the media? So that's called 1 in 10,000. And you can find that on my website, Dave Hersh, HERSH.com. And I still look for buyouts, but I only do, 1 or 2 at a time. So I just finished selling off some of my older companies. So I'm now looking at maybe, acquiring another software company or two, raising money to do that, where I would act as chairman so I can really stay involved. And
what's the profile of that kind of company?
Yeah, I typically look for $5 to $20 million revenue companies. We'll talk to a lot of them because even if it's not me doing the acquisition, I know a lot of people who do that kind of work. So I just talked to a lot of people who are thinking about recapping their business, right? Where the structure and the investors that are on board now are not ideal for the right trajectory of the business. So we talked before about these businesses that are demoralized because they're not growing at 100%, but maybe they're a good, healthy 30% grower. Those are the ones where I can come in and maybe, buy the company, work with the founders, and give them a chance at a second act that reflects the real market realities and building out something that has more sustainability over the long run. So it's typically what I look at and talk to a lot of founders who are just trying to figure out what to do with their business when they get in that period where they're no longer in alignment with the investors or, the old cap structure, or they're bootstrapped and just, need help taking it to the next level. Either one.
Yeah, no, I think it's an incredibly valuable service because too many founders are just, for want of a better word, depressed and stuck in a business that's not working the way they expect it to. And if they just admit the reality that it's a different business than they thought and go capitalize it properly with the right people on their board, they could actually really enjoy it, and it could be a good financial outcome as opposed to a zero. So I think this has been phenomenal. It's been great to hear all the things that you've worked on and the insights that you've had. This has been great for me. I hope it's been great for the people that have been listening. Again, Dave, where can people find you? Can you just repeat your website so it's super easy?
Sure, yeah. DaveHersh.com, DaveHersh.com. Newsletter is called 1 in 10,000, about finding competitive advantage in this era. And I'm on LinkedIn and do a lot of content there as well. So happy to connect with anyone.
We'll put links in the description. It's been great having you, Dave. Really appreciate it. If you, as a listener, found that helpful, please like and subscribe. It helps other people find the podcast. I'd like to thank our audio engineer and video editor, James Fix. Ryan DaCosta worked on the marketing side of production. The music was by The Great White Shark. I'm your host, Alex Shartsis. Thanks for listening.